Die wahren Ursachen der natürlichen Wirkungen und Begebenheiten sind oftmals von den Gründen darauf gefußen, von den Versuchen.
Thank you, Ruth, and thank you, Aaron, for the invitation. I'm actually privileged to be here, and I hope that I will say something interesting for you. I'm surrounded by scholars who are by far greater, scholars in Leibniz, du Châtelet, even Kant. So I hope that I can, cooperate with you in the Q&A in order to clarify some questions, especially related to Kant, because contrary to what Katherine Dunlop did, I will talk more about Kant rather than the Châtelet. However, of course, I shall refer to her in specific passages. Before starting, I would like to frame a little bit the work I'm going to present today. I'm currently leading an ERC project called Paradoxes and Metaphors of Time in Early Universes, Proteus. And it's a project including a consortium of two universities, so the University of Milan and the Autonomous University of Barcelona, where I was working until 2021. This, as you can see, is or was throughout the years, the research team I led. And now we are only 4 of us left, because the project is going to finish in 2024. There is an advisory board that is composed by historians of philosophy and physicists, and also my research team was composed by scholars in philosophy of science, history of philosophy, and theoretical physics and mathematical physics in particular. We have, if you're interested in joining us, we have an online seminar series that touches the topics of the project, that explores how we, in Western culture, we portray time in very different ways, depending on the cosmological models that we employ in different epochs. And the project, therefore, shows the relevance of the history of philosophy, even for physicists working on current quantum gravity and cosmology. And I'm particularly proud of this result, because generally, when we talk to scientists, they believe that history of philosophy is not relevant for what they do, and I wanted to show that it was not the case. So, anyway, why I'm mentioning the project? I'm mentioning the project because one of the outputs of this project is a digital archive titled Timaeus and its Legacy that focuses on the impact that Plato's dialogue Timaeus had throughout more than 2 millennia. And in particular, I must confess, as you probably know better than I found it extremely useful. I found it useful even in deepening the relationship, the intellectual relationship between Voltaire and du Châtelet. Why is that? Because we know that Voltaire wrote a small work, small essay, that is a satirical one, contra Plato's Timaeus. It wasn't immediately published. It's dated 1737, but was published in the 50s. And interestingly enough, we know that the phrase, I mean, there is a specific sentence that he uses in defining the demiurge, and we find a very similar construction of the sentence in Émile de Châtelet's work, in Destitution. So, starting from this hint, together with my research team, we explored a little bit more the issue, and we can certainly arrive, I'm pretty proud of this result, arrive at showing that of course, she was working, or she was annotating together with and commenting Plato's works, Plato's dialogues, together with Voltaire. And probably is not Voltaire that influenced her and gave her an input in mentioning the demiurge in the introduction to her work, but it's the other way around. She were seriously discussing the problem of other laws of nature. How do we think of an action, of an agency in philosophy of nature? And from there, Voltaire, who was a genius, of course, in his turn, decided to attack Plato's Timaeus. So anyway, this is just a small example of the work we have done, and I will now turn to my specific contribution for today. I want to explore indeed how Kant thought about the sciences, their unity and interrelation in architectonic terms. And I want to show, let's say, the Tantallic effort to grasp the order of the world we live in, who occupied him for his entire life until death. And I will do so by investigating the perspectives opened by the critique of the power of judgment and shaping the relationship between metaphysics and physics. And second, by sketching a little bit the scientific milieu, which Kant considered in the 90s, so late in his life, thereby identifying the scientific and philosophical questions that led him to the famous transition project, Übergangsprojekt. In the second part of my talk, I shall focus precisely on Kant's view of metaphysics and physics in the transition from the metaphysical foundations of natural science to physics that is collected in the Opus Posthumum. And I shall show how the architectonic of reason plays a role therein, but at the same time I will emphasize the great impact that Plato had on Kant's late view of the ether, the hypostatized space understood as necessary postulate, and for his late view of the foundations of cosmology and natural sciences. I shall also underline that together with the ether, he appealed to an original force of impact, thereby echoing not only his pre-critical writings, but also du Châtelet's work. And that's interesting, actually. It's interesting because Kant, at the end of his life, came back to the original topics from which he started his career. And so it's interesting because we find more references, or at least more concepts that can be related to Leibniz and du Châtelet at the end of Kant's life rather than in the proper critical period, the 80s. Of course, there are references to Wolff and Leibniz and the critique, of external teleology, for example, but for what concerns the philosophy of nature, the theory of matter, we have to go to the late period. So it's a sort of a circle, Kant's life. Started with something and ended with, so at the end of our life, probably we'll go back to our dissertations, who knows. Anyway, of course, further studies will determine whether editions of Plato's dialogues could be seen as a common source of reflection for du Châtelet's and Kant's philosophy of nature. This is something that I want to explore with my research team, indeed. Well, I leave it eventually for the discussion, further details on this topic. So let's go back to Kant. So natural sciences and their foundations constitute a guideline connecting Kant's early writings, those of the critical period as well as the late works. A large part of the literature focused on the role played by the critique of pure reason in grounding the sciences, and in particular they compared the earliest with the critical writings, including the metaphysical foundations of natural science. The present conference, as far as I can see, is rather the expression of another effort that recent literature made on Kant's early writings and its depth in order to recognize its depth to scientists after Newton, including Maschenberg, Gravesande, Dumoulin, D'Alembert, Euler, and certainly Émile du Châtelet. So, in recent times, on the other hand, the critique of the power of judgment attracted the attention of those scholars who wanted to show Kant's interest for the foundations of biology, chemistry, and experimental physics. In other words, empirical sciences and their foundations started being considered part of the dimension that Kant wanted to include in his transcendental system, although, of course, in a very specific way. This interest is rightly grounded on the fact that Kant explicitly raised the fundamental question in the third critique. And this question has to do with the status, origin, and validity of our inferences encoded by teleological judgments that are used in empirical sciences in practice. To set up the limit and an analysis of the power of judgment implies to deal with a huge part of empirical sciences and their inferences, to give them a universal principle but also limit their validity. There are several perspectives that the critique of judgment opens. I have worked in the last couple of years on that. If you're interested, there are two papers, one published in 2021 for the Goethe and another one in 2022 in Hopos, the journal for the history of philosophy of science. But in this contribution that I'm going to present today, I'll do something new now. I shall focus on only a couple of perspectives that are opened by the critique of judgment, and that I think deserve careful attention from among Kant scholars, and not only Kant scholars, historians of early modern philosophy as well. So first, Kant assumes that his critique of teleological judgment, which is free from a nomothetic, can go hand in hand with analysis developed in the first critique, and he shows this in the sections devoted to the antinomy of teleological judgment. So, if we read from the Academy edition, of course, volume 5, page 387, Kant says, "The first maxim of the power of judgment is the thesis, all generation of material things and their forms must be judged as possible in accordance with merely mechanical laws. The second maxim is the antithesis, some products of material nature cannot be judged as possible according to merely mechanical laws. Judging them requires an entirely different law of causality, namely that of final causes." Now, if one were to transform these regulative principles for research into constitutive principles of the possibility of the objects themselves, they would run thesis, all generation of material things is possible in accordance with merely mechanical laws, antithesis, some generation of such things is not possible in accordance with merely mechanical laws. In other words, Kant suggests that the scientific methodology to advance in empirical sciences implies the search for both mechanical and teleological explanations, according to which the latter can hold when there is a lack of the former. Thus, in the absence of a mechanical explanation, a teleological one can do well in all empirical sciences, including experimental physics, if and only if teleology remains ascribed to the use of reflective judgments and does not assume any constitutive role for physics. A different discourse holds for inferences regarding organisms, which must be teleological in the first stance, and I'll leave it for another discussion. Kant also adds, as further clarification, that in the case of empirical laws, I quote, of natural ends in organized beings, it's not merely permissible, but it's even unavoidable to use the teleological way of judging as the principle of the theory of nature with regard to a special class of its objects, end of quote. However, as specified in the very same third critique, pages 382-83, natural science must not jump over its boundaries, and arithmetical and geometrical analogies, as well as universal mechanical laws, can make no claim on that account to be teleological grounds of explanation within physics. And even if they deserve to be taken into consideration within the general theory of the purposiveness of things in nature, this would still belong elsewhere, namely in metaphysics, and would not constitute any internal principle of natural science. In order to avoid any appeal to a supernatural cause, Kant contends that teleology allows us to present nature as if the purposiveness in it were intentional, but at the same time ascribe this intention to nature, namely to matter, thanks to the concept of the technique of nature. Teleology in the transcendental system signifies only a principle of the reflecting, not of the determining power of judgment, and thus is not meant to introduce any special ground for causality. But it's only meant, I quote, to add to the use of reason another kind of research besides that in accordance with mechanical laws, in order to supplement the inadequacy of the latter, even in the empirical search for all the particular laws of nature. End of quote, and I'm quoting from page 383. In shaping the new role of teleology, and now comes the interesting part. In shaping the new role of teleology within his system, Kant introduces a concept of transition, Übergang, in the critique of the power of judgment, in the following terms. I quote from page 380-381. Every science is of itself a system, and it's not enough that in it we build in accordance with principles and thus proceed technically. Rather, in it, as a freestanding building, we must also work architectonically and treat it not like an addition and as a part of another building, but as a whole by itself. Although afterwards, we can construct a transition from this building to the other or vice versa. End of quote. The careful reader acquainted with the Châtelet will immediately notice how Kant's metaphor of science as a building is close to the one adopted by the Châtelet. In the 1742 edition of Institution de Physique, page 11, physics, says the Châtelet, physics is an immense building that surpasses the powers of a single person. Some lay a stone there, while others build whole wings. But all must work on the solid foundations that have been laid for this edifice in the last century, by means of geometry and observations. Still, others survey the plan of the building, and I am among them. So she focuses on the plan of the building, so on the design, let's say, that is done, before or a posteriori, like in architecture or in civil engineering, and it's very similar to the idea that Kant has, of the edifice of and the architectonic, of sciences, and therefore, in the third critique, Kant is addressing a problem different from that of the foundations of the single empirical sciences and their own domains. Is rather discussing the possible relationship among the sciences. The term Übergang, transition, acquires the specific meaning of a transition or a passage from a science to another and vice versa, which must be done a posteriori. Thus it pertains to what Kant called the architectonic of reason. It's worth noticing that in Kant's view, teleology itself is not part of theoretical natural science, but is only meant, and I quote, to designate a kind of causality in nature, in accordance with an analogy, with our own causality in the technical use of reason, in order to keep before us the rule in accordance with which research into certain products of nature must be conducted. End of quote. It's always page 383. Now, by keeping these words in mind, it becomes clear that in the 90s, Kant's reflections were meant to open new perspectives on the interrelation of different parts of his system and on which kind of internal transitions were allowed to pass from the metaphysics of nature to physics. Thus, the title of the unpublished work Übergang von der metaphysischen Anfangsgründe der Naturwissenschaft zur Physik designates a way in which we can represent physics from a completely new perspective. Namely, with it can try to accomplish the task of proposing a teleological approach to physics and to provide a priori grounds to his theory of matter governed by moving forces, by showing that we can correctly pass from metaphysics to the objects of physics and unify causality in nature without falling into the dogmatic picture of external teleology. Now, in order to understand the relevance of such a tenet for the genesis of the transition project, I will very briefly spell out the characteristic of the scientific milieu that led Kant to this enterprise. Now, in order to capture these, I will do so automatically, because otherwise there's no time. So, first, in the field of cosmology and astronomy, Kant in the early 90s was taking the cue from the works and observations of William Herschel. But he also considered the work of German astronomers such as Johann Ellerboda and Johann Hieronymus Schröter. And the latter published a number of studies that influenced at various levels Kant's late work and essays on natural science. Think of, for example, on the volcanoes on the moon, and also if we consider the excerpt of his Universal Natural History and Theory of Events that was published in 1791. So in that case, in 1791, he considered valid his view of the structure of the cosmos. So he applied mechanical laws not only to the solar system, so not only Newton's law to the solar system, but far beyond it, and imagined the universe as structured, no? So there are different solar systems that are part of galaxies, and galaxies can form clusters, and so on and so forth. So this hierarchical view persists even in the 90s. Now, in 1791, in this published excerpt edited by Gensichen of his Allgemeine Naturgeschichte, Kant ensured his primacy over Lambert's nebular hypothesis, and he also tried to use chemical affinity to clarify his theory of empirical matter and the formation of Saturn's rings. So we have therefore evidence that Kant tried to apply chemistry to astronomy, and that it still holds to be true his theory of a hierarchical and systematic order of the universe. In order to encompass these aspects within his system by grounding them on solid principles of reason resulting from the resolution of the antinomy of pure reason, it still holds that matter is indefinitely divisible, so intensively according to quality, and that the beginning in space and time of the universe is indefinite. And this is the resolution of the cosmological principle of reason. So it's the content of that principle. Now, these two tenets are important to understand that the cosmological reflections are still present in the 90s and become even more important in the manuscripts that we find in the Opus Posthumum. And I'll show that in the last part of my talk. Chemistry. Chemistry is another field that interested so much Kant. in the critical period. So in the 80s, chemistry is defined by Kant as an improper, albeit rational science that studies the changes of matter into new kinds, and it's clearly distinguished from physics. The chemistry to which Kant confers this status is the phlogistic chemistry of Georg Stahl. And we have evidence that Kant clearly distinguishes physics from chemistry, even in the 1794 essay on the influence of the moon on the weather. This has been noticed also by Bennett McNulty in 2017 and by myself in 2018. In the Opus Posthumum, Kant endorses a conception of chemistry, I quote, as the science of inner forces of matter. So it's volume 21, page 453. In particular, Kant endorses Lavoisier's elements theory, also the oxygen theory of combustion, and gives a central role to the caloric. So there is a change in its studies of chemistry. Considering also his teleological view of interrelation among the sciences, so the architectonic reflections that he developed in the third critique, one can see that Kant was looking for a bridge to be built, not only between metaphysics and physics, but also between chemistry and physics. This is quite evident in the essay of 1794 on the influence of the moon on the weather. And the hypothesis of caloric is thus eminently playing this role in Kant's late writing. So it's clear that we find so many manuscripts in the Opus Posthumum regarding the caloric, because he was working on chemistry, and he was he passed literally from Stahl to Lavoisier, and he was trying to build up internal bridges between empirical sciences and parts of his system. So he was really trying to see whether the caloric could have been, or whether we could attribute to the caloric a specific function for this. However, it must be said that as important element of chemistry, the caloric, Kant says, could be seen as hypothesis eventually, but is not to be confused with the cosmic ether that we'll talk about at the end of my talk. Biology. So the literature mainly focused on reconstructing the relation of Kant's third critique and the work of Blumenbach, concluding that Kant remained ambivalent, more ambivalent than has frequently been contended, and the convergence between the two was a bit overestimated by even Kant and Blumenbach themselves. The theory of epigenesis was central to the discussion of natural generation in the 18th century, and it's discussed in the third critique, of course. According to Zamito, Kant was never fully comfortable with the idea of epigenesis and had a problematic relationship with that theory. The reason for that is the following. In the late 18th century, epigenesis was a theory of generation endorsed by proponents of Helozoism. And we know how Kant did fight against Helozoism, which was a form of Schwärmerei. So the latter, indeed, was an expression of Schwärmerei, and for Kant, the very idea of encompassing metaphysics, physics, biology, and anthropology by ascribing intelligence or spontaneity to matter had to be completely rejected. So he could not be fully in agreement with Blumenbach. It's evident. However, an alternative proposal to unify the laws of nature must have been provided to explain such questions as the causal relations of distinct substances, the principles of action at a distance, chemical attraction, electricity and heat, biological generation, and the mind-body relation. And indeed, all these are the topics that we find in the manuscripts of the Opus Posthumum. There is a last topic that intrigued Kant a lot. And not only Kant, we know Schelling, we know a lot of people in the 90s. Electricity and magnetism. So, mostly influenced by the work of Franz Ulrich Epinus and Georg Christoph Lichtenberg. In the 90s, Kant considered the phenomenon of magnetism and electricity to be unified under a unique system of moving forces of matter. In other words, positive and negative poles were nothing else but expression of the action of more fundamental forces of attraction and repulsion, and precisely this topic is of fundamental importance for the Opus Posthumum. So, to sum up, in the 90s, natural scientists pursued the most speculative hypotheses appearing in the second edition of Newton's Optics, focusing on the properties that could be considered inherent in particulate matter. Natural scientists proposed to study attraction and repulsion and chemical and electrical phenomena in such a way that the notion of inert matter came to seem entirely inadequate, and the inquiry shifted from mathematical kinematics to experimental physics and natural history, of course, addressing the problems of imponderable fluids such as electricity, magnetism, chemical bonding, light and heat on the one hand, and the problems of organized form of life on the other. This brief overview immediately displays as something that cannot but attract our attention. First, consider that whereas in the 80s Kant mainly worked on astronomy and in offering his philosophical foundations of the mechanics, kinematics and dynamics of physical systems in general, and in the 90s his interest switched to the teleological foundations of empirical sciences. His scope was to harmonize his transcendental philosophy and metaphysics of nature with the latest advancements in the empirical sciences, which have all the stages of being rational and being part of the sciences that together with the arts constitute what he calls in the critique of judgment, human culture. So art and science are human culture, and are fundamental for the development of our species and our destination on this planet. So it's clear that even chemistry was important in this respect. It's not just physics or astronomy. So the second aspect that should attract our attention is that in 1791, in the excerpt edited by Gensichen, the excerpt of Kant's Universal Natural History and Theory of Events was an appendix to the translation, to the German translation of Herschel's on the construction of the heavens. And in this text, Kant not only presented a new hypothesis on the mechanism for the formation of Saturn's rings, but it was meant to represent a pillar against illusorism and the Schwärmerei, embodied among other things by the revival of Plato's Timaeus and the reinterpretation of the Anima Mundi contained therein. I have discussed this aspect in other papers, but the main result that I have found is that Kant certainly rejected any attempt to use the authority of Plato to converge toward illusorism. And he still thinks, however, that Plato's thought represents a fundamental step in what he called the history of pure reason, and therefore wants to reinterpret Plato's positions as seeds that germinated within the context of transcendental philosophy. So Kant's take emerged in the pages of the Third Critique in the section 62-65, where Plato is explicitly mentioned, together with some crucial themes of the Timaeus. And we have to consider that the Timaeus was recently published in 1786 in its Freiburg edition, and there was a huge debate precisely on Plato's work at the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s. Indeed, consider the Schelling's manuscripts, the commentary to Plato's Timaeus is dated 1794. So every philosopher was engaged with the Timaeus at the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s in the German-speaking world. Furthermore, the Third Critique as I mentioned before, discloses new perspectives, and even on cosmology discloses new perspectives. And that's why Kant wanted to, so to speak, readapt. So for him, the Timaeus is a sort of very primitive account of what, however, of the problems of the pure reason, problems in technical terms, so like ideas. So it shows the form in which, the way in which human reason think about the cosmological problem. The problem of agency, of external agency, the problem of time, space, and so on. However, in the third critique, Kant proposes an approach that unifies, by means of the notion of purposiveness, the static and teleological account of the universe, which he calls das Weltall, that I have called somewhere else functional cosmology. So in other words, Kant's functional cosmology asks, we find black holes at the center of our galaxies. For what do they serve? What is the purpose that we can, or the function better, that they play? Of course, we don't ask this question in these terms, but still, if we imagine the universe as a whole, and we find this structure almost ubiquitous, there must be a reason for that, okay, and we can imagine why, or at least make hypotheses. But at the same time, of course, it's different to ask, what do they do? Do they maintain equilibrium? What do they do? So that's what Kant wanted to, this type of questions he wanted to ask. Not, of course, about black holes. He didn't know about black holes, but this was the type of teleological approach to cosmology that he wanted to develop. Of course, he died afterwards, so he couldn't. But so, to shape in more detail the architectonic of reason and to justify the transition from the metaphysical foundations of natural science to physics, in order to do so, Kant was first led to rethink of the foundations of cosmology, including teleological inferences within it, and then to provide the connection by means of the notion of transition and a new schematism of different domains of a philosophical system. I shall explain this in a minute. Now, this step towards unification could have been accomplished by finding a universal a priori system of moving forces of matter governing the whole universe and ensuring the foundations of the laws of both inner matter and organisms. Thus, the problem open for Kant in the 90s could be summarized with the following questions. First, how do we build up a transition from metaphysics to physics according to the principle of purposiveness? Second, how do we judge teleologically, architectonically of the whole system that results from this unity? Third question, how do we consistently ground metaphysics in view of the whole of experience constituted by the cosmos filled with matter? And these are the topics of the opus posthumum indeed, the transition, the Übergang. So, just a caveat, I'm not at all reducing the opus posthumum just to the single question of the transition, because in the opus posthumum we find thousands of manuscripts. I mean, we find a lot of material, and we cannot reduce this to just the three questions that I mentioned, but it's evident that at least at the systematic level, these are important questions for Kant, and we certainly find manuscripts. If you use these three questions as guidelines, we can reorganize the manuscripts of the opus posthumum and try to find out a coherent account of his last view. Now, this is boring, I won't say Tuschling, Mathieu, we don't care. Let's go to the point. Now, the role of the famous ether in the opus posthumum. So we said that there is the problem of making a transition from physics to from metaphysics to physics. We know that any teleological approach does not pertain to physics itself, but it's rather the teleological approach used in architectonical terms. Therefore, how do we have to judge, in the light of these reflections, the presence of the ether, of the concept of the ether in the opus posthumum? So first, the role attributed to this postulate of the ether, which is the all-pervading and oscillating cosmic matter, is understood as a necessary assumption for making it possible to think of the universe in a reformed cosmology. As I said, and this is stated very clearly in 22:214, nevertheless, Kant is very well aware of the fact that we don't have to confuse the caloric with the cosmic ether. So one thing is the caloric as an hypothesis that is used in chemistry, and another thing is the cosmic ether. So there are two things, two very different things. In my view, the role of the ether as postulate has been a bit underestimated in the literature. It should be taken more seriously. In the sense that there are two aspects that in the literature were not considered, two aspects that I mentioned today. First question is the publication of the excerpt in 1791 of the Universal Natural History and Theory of Events. So it's clear that the cosmological stance is still present in the 90s in Kant. And second, Plato. The fact that Kant was working on Plato in the last part of his life. So these two things have been neglected in judging of the status and the function of the ether in the opus posthumum, at least in my view. And why are these details, let's say, so relevant? So what makes the postulate of the ether so interesting is its role for the foundations of cosmology and cosmogony from a transcendental and architectonic perspective. Now, consider the following passage. I quote from 21:378-79. Kant says, to assume such a matter filling cosmic space is an inevitably necessary hypothesis, for without it no cohesion, which is necessary for the formation of physical body, can be thought. All matter, however, is originally combined in a whole of world attraction through universal gravitation, and thus the ether itself would, however far it may extend, be in a state of compression even in the absence of all other matter. Such compression must, however, be oscillating, because the first effect of this attraction in the beginning of all things must be a compression of all its parts toward midpoint, with consequential expansion, and which, because of the elasticity of the world matter, must hence be set in continuous and everlasting oscillation. I don't know whether it reminds you of Timaeus, but to me it reminds me of Plato's Timaeus a lot. The secondary matter, so there is a primary matter and a secondary matter. The secondary matter distributed in the ether is thereby necessitated to unify itself, so the ether is functional in order to unify. Necessitated to unify itself into bodies at certain points. So it's like a receptacle here, the ether, right? Into bodies at certain points, and so to form cosmic bodies. This universal attraction, which the matter of the ether exerts upon itself, must be thought of as a limited space, a sphere. Consequently, as the one universal cosmic body which compresses itself in a certain degree through this attraction. It must, however, be regarded just in virtue of this original compression and expansion as eternally oscillating, and hence all cohesion can only have been produced or be produced further by the living force of impact, not the dead force of pressure. And we are back to where we started. So now I contend that the ether plays a very similar role to the chora presented in Plato's Timaeus, and it's in a sense, or at least it represents a reinterpretation. So Kant wanted to reinterpret Plato's Timaeus because he thought that in the history of pure reason, of course, his system was superior to Plato's, okay? Even if Plato arrived at understanding a little bit of how things work, okay? This is normally Kant's position with respect to Plato, but still he is commenting on it. So the point is that the similarity with the chora is functional in my view. Because it's a postulate that is necessary for the unity of experience, because it's necessary for the unity of bodies. So it's necessary to make all bodies interact within the same universe. To create cohesion, also compression, and so on. So it's necessary in this sense. But it's also necessary for us to have, therefore, a unified view of the whole of the universe, and to achieve what? The possibility of realizing the satisfaction, let's say, of the need of reason, of thinking of the idea of the world, because remember that we, anyway, necessarily think of the idea of the world. We must not fall into the trap of the antinomies and the dilemmas, but if we don't fall within them, then it's anyway needed, this idea of the whole for us. And why is that? Well, in the Opus Posthumum, volume 21, page 31, there is this beautiful passage where Kant says we need to think about it because we are cosmotheoroi, we are intelligence. We are intelligence. There's an intelligence. This is before dying, Kant thought that God was just reason and that we are intelligence. And in this universe, there is this intelligence, us. And what is the place of this intelligence in the whole design? So the ground of the motive forces of matter, because Kant insists in saying, well, I'll show you how you can pass from metaphysics to physics by building up a system of moving forces. And I will show that this system, according to the categories, so the 4 functions of judgment, beta, quantity, quality, relation, and modality, can perfectly work and account for any phenomena we find in experimental sciences. Of course, he made like tens of schemas of this classification of moving forces, because each time he found problems with some of them. So he thought first about primitive and derivative forces, then he started rethinking about attraction, repulsion, organic forces, and will, because he also wanted to incorporate and solve the mind-body relation. From a physiological standpoint, he wanted to solve, let's say, the dualism. So it's, it was a work in progress. So the ground of these moving forces of matter, however, Kant says is internal to the system of transcendental philosophy, and therefore and also to the universe itself, because it's in the ground is in the ether, so it's internal. So we don't have to appeal to God in order to think of forces in matter, of matter and in nature. So no external forces, no supreme willingness acted upon space and matter at the origin of the universe, no continue acting upon it. Kant is endorsing a position that is present also in his early writings in natural science. And as you saw, what is interesting is that he goes back to his early studies on living forces, dead forces, primitive forces, derivative forces, implying Leibniz and the Châtelet, of course. So he came back to these studies. For the transition from the metaphysical foundations of natural science to physics, Kant thought that it could have been accomplished thanks to the system of moving forces, and he calls these moving forces intermediate concepts, Mittelbegriffen. And they pertain to both fields. That's why, so to metaphysics on the one hand, force, a moving force, therefore to physics. So he thinks that this is the right concept out of which we can build up architectonically a transition. This is clearly stated in 21,478. But more interestingly, Kant portrays the transition from one to the other, so from metaphysics to physics, as a tendency inherent to the system of knowledge itself. There are several references, so 21,478, 482, etc. But the tendency in the transition from metaphysics to physics cannot be immediately satisfied with a leap. For those concepts which lead across from a system of one sort to another must be accompanied by empirical principles as well as principles a priori. So, the very same teleological meaning and function encountered in the third critique and attributed to the notion of transition from a domain to another is conserved in the Opus Posthumum. Consider, for example, the passage in 21,474-75. I quote, "Metaphysical foundations of natural science yield something that is certain and a complete system, but their purpose, the only one which can be envisaged for them, is physics, for which they can give us no material. There must be a transition from the metaphysical foundations of natural science to physics if the science of nature is to become a science of reason, Philosophia Naturalis. These two territories, metaphysics of nature and physics, do not immediately come into contact, and hence cannot cross one to the other simply by putting one foot in front of the other. Rather, there exists a gulf between the two, over which philosophy must build a bridge in order to reach the opposite bank. For in order for metaphysical foundations to be combined with physical foundations, mediating concepts are required, so Mittelbegriffe, which participate in both. Now, whereas the concept of moving forces pertain to both territories, it's alone not sufficient. This concept is not sufficient to ground the unity of the system of the world. So he needed the system of moving forces plus the ether. That's why the ether was so important for him. For the reasons I explained at the beginning, because for him, he must build up the relationship, the transition, the bridges among different sciences, assuming that they are all part of the same edifice. So there is a whole that must be presupposed. Now, what's needed is the postulation of the ether, a space that is endowed with fundamental forces, and that guarantees the continuity of matter as effect of impact and counter-impact due to oscillation and vibration of the ether. There are several passages about this. Now, interestingly, the ether is not secondary physical matter that we can directly experience. This has been so also in the 19th century, though I don't think that Kant's concept of ether is exactly the same than that tested or that Michelson Morley tried to test. But it's a postulate. And therefore, for Kant, is something immaterial. That's the point. It's something immaterial, but at the same time, it's the ground, so it's a sort of receptacle of motive forces. and it must be seen as a physical explanation for the universal dynamics of the universe. I think I have to stop, right? Okay, so yeah. Okay, so just a few remarks then. So first point, the ether is something in between. It's something immaterial that is primary matter as well. If you remember Plato's Timaeus, what does Plato say? It's a very specific kind of chora. It's an in-between, between being and becoming. So it's immaterial, it's a form, no? Being and becoming, however, no? So that is imitated by the sensible world. So that's a very intriguing aspect, a second very intriguing aspect. So the first one is the type of motion, this of oscillation that Kant attributes to the ether. This is the same that Plato attributed to the chora. And second, these are the aspects. So the fact that it's a sort of an in-between. So it's immaterial, but it's also primary matter. So it's an immaterial matter. That's the sense of absurdity of which Plato talked about, for example, in the Symposium about the instant. No? So, yeah. So Kant, as I try to underline in this contribution, tried to reinterpret some aspects of Platonic cosmology and cosmogony, and in doing so, by of course using his tools, no, of transcendental philosophy, invested, so to speak, a lot of energy in his last period in building up the transition project, so in the architectonic of reason. And also, as I tried to show, he came back to the early studies on the theory of matter that are so relevant for this conference. So I hope that I said something interesting for you today. I just proposed not the way in which we have to interpret the transition project, but just one possible way in which we can read the transition project in continuity with the third critique and the rest of Kant's system. So the result, let's say, that I think I obtained is that I clearly have shown that the Übergang, the notion of transition, is systematic in Kant. So that he gives the definition in the third critique and maintains it throughout his life. And therefore, it seems to me that late Kant is interested even in shaping a sort of a science of transition, which is an old desideratum that we find in Plato's Parmenides. And to my knowledge, no philosopher accomplished this task. And he tried, in other words, to rephrase within a transcendental picture the whole problem of an aspecial and atemporal ground of becoming and spontaneous generation of nature without appealing to divine intervention. And however, Kant, of course, never published this sort of fourth critique, and this patent remained hidden and disclosed to very few adepts for more than 120 years. However, Kant was never tempted to determine a priori an abstract concept of matter, but something that could be also empirically tested, namely we can postulate primary matter, but then secondary matter must be tested, and it must be coherent what we observe. The cohesion of bodies, the compression that we test in the lab must be coherent with the postulation of the other and its properties. And for this reason, Kant's late ontology and epistemology are rather embodied in the revised version of the scholastic dictum forma dat esse rei. And I want to conclude by reading this reflexion, 3850. I read it in German, it's better, and conclude. Forma dat esse rei, denn das Wesentliche der Sache kann nur durch Vernunft erkannt werden. Nun aber muss alle Materie der Erkenntnis durch Sinne gegeben sein. Also ist das Wesen der Sachen, sofern sie durch Vernunft erkannt werden kann, die Form. Danke. Vielen Dank.